So this recording, like the recordings in the live, in-person blue boxes, as well as last Friday's, have been uploaded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So I suggest you check those out, particularly if you missed one last week. So before I'd like to begin, I would like to acknowledge that the territory in which we are gathering, most of us anyways, is the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the Newfoundland Island as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. I would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and the Natuhavut, and the Innu of the Sinan and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. Together, we strive for respectful relationships with all peoples on this land as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation, and ultimately honor this beautiful land and its waters together. So today we have a really exciting exit seminar presentation by Julie Reimer, who's a PhD candidate in geography. Her research explores marine spatial planning and management as a pathway to ocean conservation and sustainability goals. She holds a Master of Marine Management and a Bachelor of Science in Biology, and ultimately brings a problem-solving lens to her work. Julie's research has been featured in all sorts of great places, including the Conversation, Saltwire News Network, CBC's Broadcast, and local radio across the Atlantic provinces. Julie has been recognized as a leader in organizational governance and science-based advocacy, and has served on the board of directors for CPAWS New Brunswick, the Starfish Canada, and currently serves as national president and Atlantic director of the Sierra Club Canada Foundation, while also representing Canada as an All-Atlantic Ocean Youth Ambassador. So what a great CV, Julie. Welcome. We can't wait for your presentation. So off you go. Please do leave some time for some discussion at the end, which I'll help facilitate.
Great. Thanks, Evan. And thanks everyone for being here today. I'm going to share my screen. And I put this slide in here intentionally because it's quite known in our department that people love when things move and when there are fun animations. So here you go, starting with a video title slide. My name is Julie, for those who I don't know yet or haven't had the pleasure of meeting in the department. And I am no longer in Newfoundland. I live in Kingston, Ontario, on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. And today I'm going to try to summarize for you the last nearly 4 years of work on my PhD. And we're going to talk all about a little known process that's one of my favorites called marine spatial planning. Okay, let's get into it. Just some context, because I know that there are lots of people here today who aren't really ocean people. But in case you didn't know, the ocean's kind of a big deal. It provides over 2.5 trillion US dollars globally to our economy. It's responsible for 30% of the world's carbon absorption. Almost all of our global data traffic is transmitted through underwater cables. 80% of world trade happens across the ocean surface. More than 15,000 known species. That doesn't count all the ones we don't know about yet. And the ocean provides food for more than 500 million people. So it's pretty important. And it is very important for sustainable development and some of those sustainable development goals that are coming out of the United Nations. But as we're watching this sort of global blue acceleration unfold, which is what you're seeing in this graph here, that ocean industries are increasing in their development, their production, and their scale exponentially since the 70s. And through that very process of development, the ocean itself is changing. And when rapid change happens in the ocean that covers 70% of our planet, it could represent a loss to humanity of things like resources, of critical ecosystem functioning, of life-sustaining oxygen, and of all kinds of species. So really, more than ever, ocean management needs a planning process that is coordinated and collaborative and really comprehensive so that we can meet some of our ambitious goals for a sustainable ocean. And marine spatial planning may be one answer to getting there. So MSP is a process that aims to integrate social, economic, and ecological objectives into a shared planning space so that we can use ocean resources and ocean spaces in a more sustainable way. It is a process that analyzes the distributions of ecosystem features and of human activities in both time and space to help guide management decisions. And as a practice and as a field of study, MSP has really taken off in the last 15-ish years. It's now seen in all ocean regions. More than 70 countries worldwide are undertaking MSP in some form in some places. And I just wanted to point out a couple of key dates to you here, that in 2009 was the first time that the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission released a step-by-step guide, a really influential document in how we can actually go about doing marine spatial planning. And since then, we see this huge takeoff in academic literature. This is just from a quick search in Web of Science for marine spatial planning, or maritime spatial planning as it's sometimes known. And then in 2014, the European Union implemented a directive that required member states to create marine spatial plans by 2021. Although we're really sad, only like 2/3 of EU countries actually submitted a plan on time. So that's not great. But we did see this huge proliferation in literature as people tried to understand this process and inform this process as a pathway to things like conservation and sustainability. And for the blue economy, MSP can be really important for promoting the multi-use of ocean spaces when industries and sectors overlap. It can help us to fill critical knowledge gaps. It can boost investor confidence in different ocean sectors. It can help promote capacity building once we see some of those critical gaps. And it can help us to mitigate conflicts between sectors or ocean uses, or even to foresee them before they occur. But there are a couple of things that MSP is not. It's not supposed to be used as a substitute for single sector planning. So we're not supposed to use this process just for planning renewable energy, which sometimes happens. And it's not supposed to be only conservation planning or one-time planning. That chat message isn't for me, is it? No. Okay, just checking. But sometimes it happens to be used for those things as well, which we'll talk about way further on in this presentation. In theory, MSP follows these 6 core principles. It's an ecosystem-based process. It's an integrated process, so it integrates across those objectives. It integrates across governments. It integrates across sectors. It's participatory. It is intrinsically place-based, spatial, area-based, whichever words you want to use. It's strategic. It's focusing on the long term. That's what strategic is really about. And it's adaptive. In theory, it's a process that would occur in perpetuity, and it would keep building on itself year after year, or 5 years after 5 years, as it usually is. But MSP, even though the literature has really taken off and countries have really taken up this process, it continues to face some really key challenges within institutions, the way that we govern, the way that we manage. It's challenged in the way that it tries to engage with people. It's very difficult to get at that adaptation piece. And it's still struggling to do at its core what it was meant for, which is balancing economic development with biodiversity conservation. So my research really digs into some of those key challenges, not all of them. But the intention behind what I was trying to do through my PhD was to develop guidance that could help to, as I say, amplify the potential of this process for achieving both conservation and sustainability goals. So my work kind of unfolded in 3 main chapters, and they all look at different pieces. So weaving them together has been a bit of a challenge for me at the end of my PhD. For those who are following along on Twitter, you'll know. The first chapter is really about management tools, and it's getting at that operational level of what MSP can do, or what we could do to make MSP more strategic. The second piece is really about biodiversity conservation and bringing biodiversity into MSP. And then the third is more overarching, And it's looking at the key features underneath of those MSP principles and how we can amplify the process through use of those key features. So let's get right into this first chapter of work. A bit more context though. MSP itself is a process, and the process results in a spatial plan or a spatial management plan that ultimately guides the use of different regulations and different tools to achieve whatever MSP objectives have been set through the process. And some of our most common management tools, the really popular ones that you've maybe heard of, are often area-based management tools. So I call them ABMTs in this work. And they help to regulate human activities in a specific geographically defined area. And they can be used for conservation, for resource management like fisheries, or they can be used for both types of objectives. So it's critical that we're selecting management tools that actually hold the potential or have the capacity to help us meet those objectives through the delivery of measurable outcomes. So those could be outcomes that are related to sustainability, which is the lens that this work was taken under. So this is all about how we can get to SDG 14, which is a sustainable development goal dedicated to the oceans, and it aims to conserve and sustainably use the ocean for sustainable development. And SDG 14 has 7 main targets. There are secret other 3, but we're not going to talk about them here. And these 7 targets, they're looking for things like reducing pollution, reducing ocean acidification, protecting marine environments, improving benefits to small island developing states. But this target, or this goal, and these targets have been criticized for being largely aspirational. And we're really lacking the management level guidance, the guidance that tells us how do we actually get to SDG 14, or that tells practitioners what do we do to deliver this really ambitious goal. So this study aimed at assessing the potential of some of our more common area-based management tools to deliver those SDG 14 targets based on the different ecological, social, and economic outcomes that they may or may not deliver. So we looked at 7 different tools: fully protected areas, partially protected areas, locally managed marine areas, gear restriction areas, fisheries closures, territorial user right fisheries, and particularly sensitive sea areas. And I would be happy if I lived the rest of my life never having to list those acronyms again. And then we looked at 17 outcomes. The details here aren't important. I just wanted you to see that there were 17 of them. So this work used a 4-step method. The first was a rapid systematic review looking for literature-based evidence of those different outcomes from the 7 different tools. And then where we didn't find literature-based evidence, we also had an expert opinion survey that gave us a different set of evidence so we could fill in some of those gaps or bolster the evidence that we did have. And then we used a confidence assessment method to assess how sure are we that these tools can deliver these outcomes based on the evidence that we found. And then I used a qualitative scoring system to link tools to those SDG 14 targets based on how outcomes can contribute to those targets. This is just a glimpse at that confidence assessment framework. It's adapted from the IPRES, and it looks at both the quantity and quality of evidence, that's both literature-based evidence and expert opinion evidence, and how well do those types of evidence agree within each other and with each other. So what we're really looking for is green boxes, or maybe blue boxes, where we have higher confidence that these tools can deliver particular outcomes. What we're not looking for as much are the yellows and oranges and red. I'm sorry to the colorblind if you can't see these. And those are areas where we have lower confidence. We're not as certain, the evidence is incomplete. So what we get from this is a regrettable matrix of 7 times 17. There's a lot on here, but we're going to break it down to what's most important. So if we're looking for green circles, most of them occur underneath the ecological outcomes in this chart. And most of them have a plus sign in the middle of that circle. So what we're showing here is that there's stronger evidence and we have higher confidence that these area-based management tools, for the most part, will deliver ecological outcomes. So for example, a partially protected area, we have high confidence that it will have a positive effect on things like species diversity or ecosystem function. But in contrast to this, we found a lot less certainty when it came to social and economic outcomes. We're less confident that these tools can deliver these outcomes. You see there are more circles that have positive and negative symbols in it, or maybe even a not symbol because there's no effect. So we're not as confident in what the effect will be of these tools on social and economic outcomes, or that there's enough evidence to even assess those outcomes. And there's a couple more important points here is that we did find fairly high confidence across area-based management tools where there was evidence available that these tools do not have much of an effect on reducing pollution and reducing the impacts of acidification. So then we took all of this colorful data and qualitatively scored the confidence scores to link them up to SDG 14 targets. There's still lots in here, but we're going to break it down in the same way. So this is a qualitatively developed score that shows us the potential of these different tools to deliver SDG 14 targets. And what we find is that these tools hold more potential to help us with ecologically focused targets. So things like SDG 14.2, which is about marine ecosystem management, or 14.4, which is about sustainable fisheries. 14.5 is about ocean conservation. So it makes good sense that things like fully protected areas and partially protected areas have higher potential to help us meet these SDG 14 targets. But if you look to this faded out column over here in 14.6 and 7, those circles are smaller. And it's because these tools hold less potential to help us with targets that are more focused on the social and ecological system. So second to this, we see that confidence about reducing pollution and ocean acidification, which are SDG 14.1 and 3 respectively. We see that carry over here, that these tools seem not to have the potential to help us with SDGs that are related to really more systemic issues. So if you think about pollution and acidification, those are more talking about land-based issues, systemic issues in plastic production, and systemic climate change. I'll also highlight down here that there's a bit of a null across the potential of this one tool. This is a particularly sensitive sea area. It's a shipping tool. And what we really found was there just wasn't enough evidence to assess the outcomes and how confident we are in those outcomes for this tool. And that may speak to how these tools end up being layered. So often a PSSA actually gets put on top of something like a partly protected area. So we're not measuring the outcomes of the PSSA in and of itself. What's most important here, the take-home message of this work, is that the tools that hold the most potential are also tools that regulate more than one ocean activity or human use in a shared space. So they're not focusing just on one fishery at a time or just on one activity at a time. They're actually pulling together different ocean uses and managing them in one overlaying tool. And what was a bit surprising was that this LMMA, which is a locally managed marine area, did so well because there wasn't that much literature-based evidence for this tool, but experts were quite certain about the positive outcomes from this tool. And that's reflected in these SDG 14 potential scores here. And we also see that this tool has a little bit higher potential for achieving some social and economic outcomes, which might tell us something about how important local involvement is in the way that we design these management tools and the way that we choose to get to SDG 14. This research overall showed us a need to address a few things. First, that there are some pretty significant evidence gaps for understanding the social and economic outcomes from these common tools. Second is that it will be really important for us to place these tools into wider land sea management or something like marine spatial planning. And a process like MSP can help us to actually see how these different tools can work synergistically, especially when we're talking about multi-sector tools and how they can help us get to SDG 14. So that's chapter 1. Now we're going to go do something a little different and talk about conservation ready marine spatial planning and really dig into this idea that MSP should bring conservation and economic development or blue growth into the same planning space. But first, a bit more context. In practice, MSP does often tend to prioritize sectoral planning or blue growth planning over biodiversity conservation. So it tends to dilute the role of conservation in marine spatial planning and in sustainability. But we know that biodiversity conservation is actually essential to sustainability, and therefore it makes sense that we would make an effort to really integrate conservation into ocean planning in a meaningful way. So looking beyond just the use of marine protected areas, because other people have already done that work really well, this study explores the broader inclusion of conservation in MSP practice. So I used an in-depth qualitative document analysis and case study analysis to explore how conservation principles and priorities have permeated MSP practice with the intention of trying to identify a pathway towards stronger integration. So I looked at 5 different case studies, most of them in what was Europe, formerly Europe, and one in Washington State in the US. And I was looking for how conservation in a broad sense was captured. So here we're using an IUCN definition of conservation, that it is the protection and management of ecosystems, populations, and species to maintain conditions for long-term survival. Conservation principles in this work were really considered to be key concepts in biodiversity conservation, things like resilience, biological connectivity, things like being long-term, versus priorities, which were potential action areas or objectives for conservation, things like protecting habitat or endangered species or protections against invasive species. So I looked across those 5 case studies, and in general, I found that there were different ways that conservation was captured. So it could be through guiding principles, they could be setting specific goals, they could be referencing specific conservation management tools. So something like a marine protected area, most often a marine protected area. But when I got into some more finer detail qualitative coding for these case studies, what I found was that most of these plans tended to focus more heavily on reducing or managing impacts from ocean activities, or in general sustainability, which captured things like the blue economy, sustainable resource use, SDG 14. Those are all encapsulated in this sustainability code. And then everything that was relating more closely to those conservation principles and priorities, they were scoring under 10% of all references across all case studies. So everything that is underneath of the 10% here, those are some of these conservation principles and priorities. Things like particular conservation tools, again, protecting habitat, resilience, endangered species, those all didn't come up very often. And then there's also this other codes category, and that is anything that was coded 7 or fewer times across all case studies. So they did not come up very often. And those are some really important concepts that are tucked away in there. Things like connectivity between ecosystems, things like ecosystem function and long-term planning for conservation. So we see that things like reducing and managing impacts and sustainability come up clearer in MSP than maybe these finer conservation principles and priorities. And if we look across the case studies, there are some differences between them that are driving that bigger picture look at what all of the codes look like. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I just wanted to flag a couple of things for you. And first is that that reducing and managing impacts code that was very prevalent. It was really driven by the Belgian, Scottish, and Washington cases. And then that significant portion, not in the statistical sense, everybody calm down, that sustainability code was really driven by how often the Welsh case study relied on concepts of sustainability, and then sort of related concepts of resilience were quite prominent in the Welsh case study. And then digging into some of the conservation bits, the Belgian case study has more references than average to marine protected areas, likely because this is the only plan I reviewed that is more at a management level. So it's actually setting things like boundaries for marine protected areas, which the other plans weren't doing. They were higher level, often planning frameworks. And then we also see that the Norwegian plan in yellow here made more references than average to endangered species and habitat protection, which are some of those conservation priorities. So I tied all of these codes together, my qualitative analysis together, into a series of themes that reflect the way that conservation is or sometimes is not captured in marine spatial planning. So in order of prevalence, the first theme that came across very clearly was prioritizing economy. And that sounds exactly like what it is. It's when biodiversity conservation sort of takes a back seat to economic development. So this comes through in references to things like making sure that marine protected areas don't have an impact on existing industries. So sort of the industry comes first under this theme. Second is ecosystems as fundamental, and it's quite the opposite of prioritizing economy. This is recognizing that biodiversity is essential in ecosystem functioning and sometimes making that link to sustainability. Ecosystems as functional is like one step removed from that. It's really about ecosystem services. It's that anthropomorphic view on ecosystems in terms of what they can deliver to our economies or our societies. And then one more step removed is ecosystems as limits. Often plans would recognize that they could develop an ecosystem up to some sustainable maximum without actually defining what that maximum is or how we manage within that maximum. And then the last and least prevalent theme in this work was about social ecological systems. So that's how the ecosystem relates to the social system and things like human well-being. And that came across in a few plans. So through this work, we propose this idea that conservation ready MSP is actually more prepared to support and enact conservation. And that by being conservation ready, that will allow us to better integrate biodiversity objectives with blue economy, blue growth objectives in marine spatial planning. And I propose in this work that conservation readiness sort of exists on this scale, and it aligns with the themes that I've identified through this qualitative work. So plans that really favor ecosystems as fundamental, which came across quite clearly in the Belgian plan, they may be more conservation ready than plans that favor even ecosystems as functional, which was really prevalent in the Norwegian plan. And then those still are more conservation ready than plans that are prioritizing things like ecosystems as limits or prioritizing the economy, which was really clear in the Scottish plan. But it's important to see those colored dots that align with the different case studies. These themes really overlap, and it's more about giving preference to one idea or another, or leaning one way a little bit more than another that could help to make plans more conservation ready. But this concept is not about biasing MSP towards protection. Like I said at the start of this talk, MSP is not a substitute for conservation planning. The idea here is that MSP can embed these principles and priorities of conservation as a means for serving integration and ultimately sustainability. Small caveat, MSP is extremely diverse, and the plans that I studied here reflect really only one type of Eurocentric MSP. And second to that, we don't actually assess the outcomes from marine spatial plans and whether or not they're delivering conservation objectives. So for example, we don't look at whether or not the Belgian Marine Spatial Plan increased species diversity. That's not the intention here. We're suggesting that conservation readiness based on this analysis could be improved when we include conservation as a dedicated component of spatial plans, similar to the way that we include other ocean uses and sectors. But what we're not suggesting here is that this should come before recognizing the fundamental role of biodiversity and sustainability. That's still important. And then secondly is that conservation readiness could be improved when we're making specific conservation commitments through MSP. And the take-home message here is that integrated MSP that is conservation ready reflects that biodiversity is the foundation of a sustainable ocean. That's chapter 2. We're going to move ahead into chapter 3, which attempts to bring some of these pieces and concepts together in a higher level index, because MSP still is facing those challenges like we talked about in institutions, in governance, in getting at that integrated piece. It's still struggling with engagement and how do we do participation in MSP? It's still struggling with adaptation. How do we bring in things like climate change into MSP? And it's still struggling to balance development with conservation, which I'm hoping we could combat by using that concept of conservation readiness, but we'll get at it in this chapter as well. So this goes back to those 6 key principles of MSP, that it is ecosystem-based, integrated, participatory, place-based, strategic, and adaptive. But some of these words might be familiar to some of you as sometimes almost independent fields of study. And it's because each of these principles, they have their own key features. They have their own diverse requirements, and they come to life in MSP in really different ways. So this study is exploring those principles, and the purpose is to identify what the key features of those principles are in the context of MSP. What does it mean for MSP to be integrated? And then we build those features together into an index that can help to amplify the potential of MSP from those theoretical principles, hopefully to practice. So this work used a review of some core MSP guiding literature, like that step-by-step MSP guide that I mentioned at the start that came out in 2009. There's a sister document that came out in 2014 that's about evaluating MSP. And those 2 pieces really informed the bulk of this work, but we supplemented with some other key literature that guides MSP best practice under these different principles. And initially, I identified 218 key features, which was a small nightmare. And then I qualitatively sorted those, so used cutting and sorting to combine those features where there were duplications, where there was overlap, the features were really similar. And in the end, what I came up with, I did it all through paper. This is the main thing Charlie Mather taught me in my time at MUN, was that we should never underestimate the value of colored paper and markers. And I did all of this work on paper because I'm very, very visual. So at the end, once I combined all of those 218 features into something more useful, we have an MSP index that comprises 36 key features, 6 features per MSP principle. And then I developed this into a qualitative scoring system that can help to gauge and guide MSP progress. This is not an evaluation tool, which I will talk about in a few more slides. That scoring system uses 0 to 3, from absent, this feature doesn't exist in the spatial plan, to excellent. This feature fully exists already, and most, if not all, of the qualitative elements of that feature, the requirements of that feature, they exist. I am not going to show you all 36 features today. It's just too much information, but I do have some extra slides at the end of this if people are curious or you'd like to know what all of the components of this index look like. But I wanted to show you one. So this is the adaptive principle and the 6 features that make up this principle. So climate change, evaluation, monitoring, modification, resource allocation, and uncertainty. So those are the key features of this principle. And for a plan to score 3 on this feature, this whole statement needs to be true. There need to be reliable investments made in MSP, routine and systematic monitoring for management outcomes compared against a baseline, an initial description of the state of the system using indicators. So all of those components need to be true for a plan to score 3 on just this feature. So really, most plans end up scoring something like 2 in here. other plans 1 or 0, because adaptation is hard. You'll see in a few slides what that looks like. But we wanted to make 3 the really gold standard of we're already doing this, it exists, and it's going. Whereas 2 is more like we're on the way. I tested this framework. I applied it to one's still in progress. There's a 6. There's a surprise 6 that's not done yet because it's the longest document I've ever seen in my life. But here's 5 results today. They were randomly selected from the Intergovernmental Oceanographics Commission sort of online database of marine spatial plans. And the results are pretty exciting. They give us this high level comparison of really different types of spatial plans and how they're sort of getting at those key principles of MSP. I don't want to say how well they're doing at that principle, because it's not an evaluation tool. It's more about giving a temperature check on where we're at and where we could be going as maybe MSP practitioners if someone chose to use this framework. But what we can see is that there are some principles that plans tend to do really good with. For example, place-based scores pretty high. So this would be out of 18, six features times 3 possible points each. That's 18. That's what the black circle around the edge is showing you. Most of the plans that I looked at tended to do good in this place-based feature or principle, which made lots of sense because spatial planning is intrinsically place-based. But then there are some other ones that plans tended to not perform so high in, most particularly in adaptation. So most of the plans that I've looked at have scored rather poorly in adaptation. And this could tell you something at a high level on sort of research gaps for MSP, issues for MSP practitioners, real challenges in getting to that phase of MSP. I forgot to change the slide. Across plans, it can reveal common challenges, things like missing the adaptation boat. But I want to dig into a couple of these because these scores can reflect MSP really as a product of their time, or it can reflect MSP at different scales. So this is based just on the MSP documents that are publicly available in English. So that's a limitation of this work. And the Ireland plan, this came out in 2021. It's a new plan. You can consider this plan as using the current best information on marine spatial planning and trying to bring that to life. So they have the highest score, whereas this plan from the province of Bataan in the Philippines, this is from 2007. It was before that IOC MSP guide even existed. And it's on a much smaller scale. So it could also tell you something about local or provincial level capacity for doing MSP and different MSP needs, which we'll get at a little bit here. They don't reflect the full context of marine spatial planning because I didn't work on the Kiribati Marine Spatial Plan. I don't know the full details of it, and I'm just basing it from what I can on publicly available documents. And looking at these scores alone isn't enough to understand the full plan. So in the case of this Kiribati plan, this is really a marine protected area. It was listed by the IOC in their database. It was randomly selected, so we did include it. But that's why you see things like this ecosystem-based score being so high, because the objectives of this area are strictly biodiversity conservation. And then participation is so low because the Phoenix Island is incredibly remote, and the only people that live there are actually involved in the management of the marine protected area. So participation isn't as important for this plan as it would be for a different plan. And then this example from Israel, this is really an academic proposal for marine spatial planning in Israel. It's not sort of sanctioned or taken up by the Israeli government. It was about informing a pathway towards MSP. And it's a great little document, but this score doesn't reflect the full reality of where that plan comes from. So it's just important to remember that there are some limitations to looking at these high level sort of assessments. And that's again why I say this is not an evaluation. It's more about guiding the process and helping practitioners look at something like this, or helping academics look across the landscape of marine spatial plans and seeing where the challenges are. All of this to say that these index scores would be improved, I think, had they been based on expert and practitioner opinions from those particular MSP case studies, because they have the deep knowledge on whether or not the key features of integration really exist. And again, in case it wasn't clear, this index does not evaluate plan effectiveness. We're not looking at whether or not these plans deliver particular outcomes. It's really meant to gauge MSP progress, and it can help indicate areas for improvement. The MSP index, I hope, can support practitioners and guide MSP toward best practices that are really based in these fundamental MSP principles. So these are the 3 chapters of work. The first one, as a refresher, looks at how common area-based management tools can help us get to SDG 14. And the takeaway message there is that tools that are regulating more than one ocean use in a shared space, things like protected areas or locally managed marine areas, they hold the most potential to help us get to SDG 14. The second chapter of work proposed this concept of conservation-ready MSP, that by recognizing ecosystems as fundamental or even as functional for sustainability, then we can bring conservation principles and priorities into MSP in a more meaningful and integrated way. And then the third chapter is this high-level look. It gives a means for comparing across different types of marine spatial plans, but it also allows people working in MSP to really dig into some of those key features and find out which ones maybe are missing in their marine spatial plan. Why does it look like participation is so low in your marine spatial plan? And how can I get to doing that better? Oops. Surprise animation. The story of my PhD is that MSP holds the potential to support goals for a healthy and sustainable ocean. But in over a decade of practice, those principles of MSP have been really unevenly applied. So through the selection of management tools, MSP can better target sustainability goals as a place-based and a strategic process. Through conservation readiness, MSP can better integrate biodiversity with sustainability as an ecosystem-based process and an integrated process. And through the use of these key features, I hope that the potential of MSP can be amplified as these theoretical principles become fully realized in MSP practice. But for those who don't know, I've recently started working for Fisheries and Oceans Canada and their MSP team. And I see some of my colleagues from my MSP team are online today, which means a lot because I had a crazy morning, so I can't imagine what your day is like today. But what I've learned in my very short time already is that the gap that exists between MSP theory and practice and between scientists and practitioners, it has to be bridged. And only if we can do that will MSP be able to reach its full potential. This is like the shortest thank you list in the whole world. There are many other people that should be on this list, but first and foremost, thanks to, I'm gonna call them my supervisory cohort. Rudolph, thanks for showing up on a Friday evening, that's real nice. And Joachim Claude and Charlie, who manages to keep me tethered to the Department of Geography. And then Natalie, Reese, and Tundi have been co-authors on the second chapter of my research, and I've really appreciated being able to learn from those incredible brains. Before you ask me this question, no, I did not take these photos. They are all from the Creative Commons. It's a great resource. And I thought that my colleagues at MUN would be concerned about my well-being if I made a presentation with no GIFs in it. So I threw one in at this last slide. But I'd be happy to take any questions or to chat on any of these pieces here today or beyond. This is how you can get in touch with me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Julie. Congratulations. What a wonderful presentation. Managing to take us through your entire dissertation. It was really quite fantastic. Do we have any questions, reflections, comments? Yes, Carissa.
I have a stats question for you. I'm totally just kidding.
I don't have a stats answer for you.
I really appreciated that the moments of humor throughout your presentation, and it was a fantastic presentation as always. This is truly more of a comment than a question, but in a good way. I just wanted to say that this is fantastic to see everything that you have put together over your time in the geography department. And it has been such a pleasure to have you in the department. I'm taking the stealing back the grad officer reins from Charlie for a second, because I was the grad officer for most of your degree and got to teach you at the start. So to see what you started with in 6,000 and where you've gotten is incredible. So congratulations.
Yeah,
Also,
it's a little different than my proposal, you may have noticed.
We don't look back at proposals, Julie.
Only looking forward.
Also, Rodolphe had to step out to go out for a drink of wine, but he sent me a message to say, incredible presentation as always. And he wanted to make sure that you thoroughly bragged that he said you were too modest about your first chapter. It was how many, quote Rodolphe, how many PhD students have their first chapter published in a Nature journal? So congratulations on your talk and your research.
It's super on brand that Rodolphe left to have a glass of wine. I'm happy for him.
Thanks, Carissa. Is that Marie Michelle?
It is. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Julie. Sorry, I'm going for a walk. It's a beautiful day, listening to a beautiful topic. So I just wanted to say congratulations on this presentation. Super informative and interesting. And for those of you who don't know, I'm one of Julie's colleagues at DFO. I did have a question for you, actually, kind of relating to work, in the sense that throughout your research, have you come across any case studies or MS plans or processes that looked at conservation beyond just one spatial area and more from a conservation network perspective? And if that connectivity took into consideration potential future MPA sites that would then add to the effectiveness of the conservation objectives?
Yes.
I don't know if
the short answer is yes. Some plans
Okay.
do that, or they have the intention to do that. The Belgian plan has like a little network within it. And they're sort of considering future sites. Like in the same way that we have AOIs in Canada, they have some like candidate areas that are incorporated into the plan. But most of the plans that are doing like MPA sort of conservation networks within it are a lot smaller regions than what we're trying to accomplish in Canada. So it's, it's not super comparable, but there are lots of plans that do incorporate existing MPAs and future MPAs, but not as many that incorporate just current MPAs, particularly plans that are really focused on blue growth. They tend to only incorporate what's existing and not do that really predictive part of MSP. That's another area where MSP tends to fail is it's difficult to get that predictive science into the planning process.
All right. Thank you.
I'm preaching to the choir. She knows already.
I was like, we've looked at it like, well, from me, high level perspective, but I was wondering if there was something out there that was definitely a lot more tangible and could be, the guiding light for us. But yeah, I mean, Canada is such a big country with a lot of diverse ecosystems, which makes it very difficult. But anyways, thank you.
Thanks, Millie. See you Monday.
Charlie.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Evan. Yeah, so congratulations, Julie. That was an amazing presentation. I saw some tweets that you sent out earlier today, which talked about how your thesis did or didn't hold together. Well, I mean, I can say that it actually does hold together really strongly based on what you presented. It's really excellent. But I do have a specific question, and it might also help you think about how you will write your concluding chapter. Because one of the things that come across the three cases that you've got, or at least the three kind of interventions, is that in each case, the better MSP ends up being a much more complicated one, in a sense, to implement, right? So you've got a situation where the simple MSP doesn't really do a very good job. The really complicated one actually looks like it's going to do a good job, but then it sort of then sets obligations for those people that are implementing them, that it's the more complicated ones. And I was thinking about that last flower that you showed with the Ireland case, right? So now the Ireland case has a nice big flower with all the, ones highly populated. But then again, you're trying to now manage all of that much more complicated situation. Anyway, so it's something that maybe you want to speak about now, but it would be something to reflect on definitely in the conclusion.
Yeah, it's actually been really great timing, me starting this work with DFO while I'm also trying to conclude my thoughts on my PhD work, because I feel like I've seen behind the curtain and I'm a little bit terrified, because the science is thinking about MSP in a way more simple form than what's actually happening in government. And even within one of those principles, so for example, within the principle of being integrated, I see that as one thing with 6 key features that have descriptions. But now when I look at those, I can see how incredibly complicated it is to do things like multi-level, provincial, federal, sometimes municipal level coordination in MSP. And that could be just for one objective, right? That could be just related to renewable energy. And then we're still talking about all of these other pieces that have to come together in MSP. So it's a great observation. That was very helpful, as usual, Charlie, that the sort of closer we get to that idealistic MSP, the more difficult it will be to actually implement or even check the boxes in the process. And that's certainly what I've learned over the last few weeks, and working with the MSP team in Canada. And it's going to be a long haul. All of my case studies make a lot more sense to me now.
So Julie, we have a comment and a question on the chat from Rachel Zurcher. Great presentation, Julie. Such interesting work. I was wondering if you could say more about this gap between theory and practice. Do you have thoughts on how we as ocean scientists can better align our research with the actual challenges that planners are facing? Yeah, I do. And also, hey, Rachel, thanks so much for coming today. That's really nice of you. Rachel has helped me quite a bit in the thinking around my 3rd chapter, and is a postdoc, and has been really nice to talk to a postdoc about my research. And there wasn't one of those in my department before, so it's nice to have connected with Rachel. Yes, I do have some ideas about this. And first and foremost, ask people in MSP planning, in government, as far as I can tell, are incredibly overworked. And there are these huge research needs that they could use support on. And if we're making those connections as scientists, we're taking sort of the initiative to reach out to marine spatial planners and practitioners to say, hey, I'm developing a new research project. What do you actually need? I should say that very much informed my 2nd chapter of research. I had some connections at DFO Maritimes region, and I went and I asked, I'm doing this work around how conservation fits in marine spatial planning. What do you really need to know? And I don't think I answered their questions in the end at all, but that to me is the first step, is that us as ocean scientists have a responsibility to take real steps to try to close that gap. And I see that on all fronts. That's just the way that I approach science and sort of activism, which I think everybody here already knows about me. Thanks, Julie. Evan.
Thank you, Julie. That was an awesome presentation, and you set the bar very high for all the other students in the program. So good for you. One of the, as I've watched integrated coastal zone management, as it used to be called, getting turned into marine spatial planning, I'm looking for the conservation needle in the MSP haystack. Am I lost, or am I just becoming cynical?
No, I don't think you're lost. I think those are really, I mean, I can't answer whether or not you're being cynical. That's really your own self-reflection. I don't think you're lost. I think that it sometimes feels to me like it's, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And conservation often, cedes space to other activities, and we see that in marine protected area planning. But I think MSP goes further than ICZM does in being an integrated process. ICZM, to me at least, was really about, for one thing, coastal zone uses and those overlaps and conflicts that are happening in a more urgent way. And I think MSP has a bit more space because it is intrinsically wider to actually bring conservation in different ways. So what I'm trying to get at in my second chapter is that it's not just about marine protected areas. It's about all of these other things that we do for conservation and all of these other regulations that can be brought into a marine spatial plan that maybe didn't exist in some of these other sort of ocean processes that we've seen evolve through the years. But I hear you on the terms. It's incredibly frustrating that it does feel like we're just turning, we turned ICZM into just integrated management, and now it's turning into just marine spatial planning, and sort of teasing those apart has been a struggle for me. And I don't think some days it makes sense and some days it doesn't make any sense at all. And that's a summary of what it's like doing a PhD.
Thanks. I think there's another question after me from Lillian.
Yes, Lillian, is this going to be a quick one? Because we have a minute left.
Yeah, it can be quick. Thank you, Julie, so much. That was really, I learned so much during your presentation. And I'm wondering, when you say place-based, if you make any differentiation between like a whole nation or like a local place-based plan, and if there was any factoring in of local versus or provincial versus national.
Yeah, place-based is all-encompassing term for anything that is spatial. So the actual features of that principle aren't really linked to which scale it is. It's more like, does it have an inventory of spatial data? Does that exist? Is the scale that it's using appropriate for its objectives? So that could be at a local scale, or it could be at a whole exclusive economic scale. And that comes across in those different case studies that I showed you, where they scored sort of similarly in place-based, because the Bataan plan in the Philippines is a really small area, especially compared to things like all of Ireland's exclusive economic zone. So the scale is important in the way that the feature sort of comes to life, but that framework can be used across different scales.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, everyone, please join me in thanking our wonderful speaker who did a fantastic exit seminar, Julie Reimer. Please join us in person next Friday when we have Daniel Kudla joining from Memorial's Department of Sociology. So I wish you a wonderful weekend. Thanks again, Julie, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Evan. Bye, everyone.
This is the awkward part where you just watch everyone drop away.
There's like an actually important message in this chat that I'm trying to go back to.
Great job, Julie.
Thank you. That was fun. Thanks, Evan, for coordinating. I really appreciate all the work it takes to go in to get the blue boxes happen.
It's my pleasure. It was just such a great, succinct kind of presentation. So fantastic to hear you speak.
Good, I'm glad it came across that way, because it doesn't always feel that way in my brain.
You know, Rathana and I are doing some work with DFO Maritimes as well on social science and humanities, and whether, they can do some.
Yeah. Would be nice. I don't know.
Yeah. So I'm sure we have lots to chat about more. So I would love to keep in touch and check in on you later if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. Would love to connect anytime.
Great. Awesome. Okay.
Take care. Also, other Evan, nice to see you.
Yes. well done.
Thank you.
And I guess I'm putting DFO on the spot about it does feel like the conservation needle in the MSP haystack sometimes. And I
Yeah.
suppose that's because government has to do the priority of, what's going to bring money in.
Yeah. The like DFO issue is that basically there was funding in a program for conservation network planning, and now there's funding in a program for marine spatial planning. And in
Right.
some regions, conservation network planning is going forward, and then in other regions they sort of pressed pause on it. And that's like a question that I'm working on with DFO right now, in my role is like sort of what are the issues around if we proceed separately or if we bring them together. And this is where I've learned that it's just so much more complicated than I thought, because I'm working with the national headquarters team, and so you sort of see all of these disparate regions kind of doing their own thing, and we want them to pull together, and it's just not as straightforward as science leads you to believe.
Yeah, and as it looks like on paper.
It looks so much more straightforward on paper.
Where are you physically?
I live in Kingston, Ontario, so I work remotely for NHQ in Ottawa.
Okay, right. Okay.
Yeah, I'm hoping to move back east, but we'll see where we land.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've got MSP funding now to look at deep sea corals, and so it's
Oh yeah.
and that's in our region at least. A lot of I think when DFO Newfoundland had to pick areas in a hurry, they use our coral data to do that. And so now we're looking at things like geographic variation and growth rates as an MSP funded project. And so it has some cool science at it. I'm not sure that it will lead to a conservation outcome.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me like the conservation decisions have been made. Okay, we're going to go with marine refuges, and now we've marked them out on the map, and we've said what can happen in them according to the Fisheries Act, and we're going to walk away because we've got other things that we can tick that box of 10% by 2020 and walk away.
Yeah.
And,
it's I've never worked for government before, and I truly feel like I've seen behind the curtain, and everything is extremely urgent and extremely slow. It's a fascinating place to work and to like a hilarious experiment and do a PhD in a thing and now try to do it in real life.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. Like they're constantly running up against their funding deliverables in the same way that academics are. So it's kind of funny that we live in such separate worlds, but we're really doing the same. We're facing the same problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When's graduation for you?
I'm hoping to submit by the end of December, and then defense. So I ideally in the spring, but we'll see.
Okay, right, because that's why you had to present this semester, so you could do that before you submit your thesis. Okay. Yeah. Well done, and good for you, and good luck.
Thank you.
If there's any way that I can help you, just let me know.
For sure. Yeah, it's nice to know there's still sort of people cheering for you in your department.
Always.
Always.
All right.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.